Hello and welcome to The Interview. It seemed last year as though the Obama administration was disengaging from Syria, backing away from airstrikes against the Assad regime and allowing red lines to be crossed on the use of chemical weapons. But in his State of the Union speech a few weeks ago, President Obama gave hints of a more muscular approach to supporting the Syrian rebels, something that may have been given fresh impetus by the deadlock at the Geneva peace talks and the disastrous humanitarian situation in Homs and elsewhere on the ground. To take a closer look at the US direction on Syria, I'm joined by Firas Maksad. He's a political consultant in Washington, D.C., and a former associate to Ambassador Dennis Ross, the former US Middle East presidential envoy. He's also worked for the International Relations Committee of the US House of Representatives. Welcome to the program, sir. A few days ago, the US ambassador to the UN talked about around 5,000 people reportedly being killed in Syria just since the Geneva II talks began. In the words of Samantha Power, the most concentrated period of killing in the entire duration of the conflict. Do you think Geneva II is actually making things worse? Is it linked to this death toll, perhaps?
Well, I don't know if it's making things worse, but it's certainly not making things any better. These talks, one would say, were deadlocked from the get-go, and what we saw translating on the ground, which is what you referred to, was actually the regime intensifying its bombing using barrel bombs over Aleppo. The only thing that came out of it, which one possibly can say was a silver lining, is that very limited agreement over Homs.
Is there any chance that the US could do more, perhaps to help broker local truces or somehow help to ease the lives of some of the Syrians who are living under siege?
Right. I mean, there are at least two possible approaches to this. One could be to sit back and do damage control and allow this war to drag on. And essentially, by and large, that's what this administration has been doing for the past 3 years. It's essentially trying to minimize the spillover effect into neighboring Lebanon, into Iraq, into Jordan, and also Turkey and Israel. But that only means that the human tragedy and the instability that is inflicting the region will continue. I mean, we have millions of refugees. Almost half of the Syrian population has now been displaced, whether internally or to elsewhere in the region. Now, that's one approach. But what I'm starting to sense is a feeling that added pressure needs to be brought to bear on the Syrian regime for it to start moving if we are to have any chance at a diplomatic breakthrough, negotiations between the regime and the opposition.
Let's take a quick listen. Sorry, I'll just jump in there, Firas Maksad, so that we can take a quick listen to President Obama's comments on Syria at the State of the Union address in late January.
In Syria, we'll support the opposition that rejects the agenda of terrorist networks. And we will continue to work with the international community to usher in the future the Syrian people deserve, a future free of dictatorship, terror, and fear.
Fine words, but what does that really mean? Do you think that's a sign of providing more lethal assistance to rebels, and if so, to which ones?
So that's the big question. That's what policy folks here in Washington, D.C. are trying to find out. Whether this is really an inflection point in President Obama's policy towards Syria, a turning point that is meaningful, or whether, in fact, it is just some tactical change. My sense is that the broader strategy of this administration remains unchanged. As the President Obama's National Security Advisor, Susan Rice, put it late last year when the president called for a review of his Middle East policy. She said that we are trying to save, quote unquote, President Obama from being dragged into yet another Middle Eastern war. This administration from the very get-go was interested in ending wars in the Middle East, not being engaged in new ones. It is often said that President Obama is more interested in the middle class here in the United States, in economic revival and development, than they are interested in the Middle East per se. So that said, and from what we know about this administration, I think that we might have some changes on the sidelines. I think we might see some lethal weapon being supplied to more moderate rebel forces, especially on the southern front, where Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, ISIS, some other more radical groups are weaker than they are up north. But again, I think it's on the sidelines is to bring added pressure. The strategy on Syria doesn't change, which is to try and get to a negotiated political settlement between the regime on one hand and the opposition on the other.
So you sense a small tactical shift there. Do you think that shift is going to be okay with US public opinion, which of course is firmly against any war in Syria? That's been borne out by numerous opinion polls. Or do you think even a slight change, for example, as you said, providing some lethal assistance by cooperating with the Jordanians on that front where the jihadist groups are less powerful, could even that be seen by a war-weary US public as the thin end of the wedge?
You know, there was a very telling story coming out of Munich at a security conference last week where Secretary of State John Kerry met with a number of members of the Senate, the U.S. Senate and the Congress, in which they've been known to support a stronger, more robust U.S. approach to Syria. I'm thinking about John McCain and Lindsey Graham and others here. And Senator Kerry reversed the situation and said, well, what do your constituents think? Are your constituents supportive of a more robust policy on Syria? And of course here there's a great degree of selling the policy that the White House needs to do, that some of the senior members of the Congress need to do to educate the U.S. public as to why it's important for the U.S., for U.S. national interest, to act on Syria. Now, that said, I think being able to sell added lethal support to the less radical groups, to the moderate opposition, is much easier than it is to sell U.S. strikes or another war in the Middle East, because that, you're absolutely right, the U.S. public will not stand for.
Firas Maksad, I want to bring in one other player, which is a very important one in this conflict. That's Iran. And of course, this is something that U.S. foreign policy makers have their eye on a lot. Is there any appetite, do you sense, within the foreign policy community that there's some kind of appetite of any kind for a grand bargain with Iran that would cover, among other things, Syria and Hezbollah?
It is a very appealing proposition. It does come up in conversations. However, there is also an acknowledgement that should we open that box, should we start negotiating with the Iranians on the Gulf security, on energy supplies, on Lebanon and Hezbollah, on Syria, and so on and so forth, that would really complicate what is the major issue on the agenda here, which is the nuclear program. So this administration has had the preference of to focus solely on the nuclear program, given that a deal on that issue in itself is an uphill battle. And the president would hate to find himself in a year's time or a year and a half's time having to conduct military strikes against Iran and finding himself engulfed in yet another Middle Eastern war, because there is real pressure on him, both in Washington, from Congress, from Capitol Hill, and from some of his allies in the region to go in that direction. So it's the nuclear program that's the focus for now. Perhaps in some side conversations that are off the record that we don't know of, there is a talk about Syria. But again, I don't perceive that to be the driving issue.
And presumably, given that he's going to visit Saudi Arabia in March, that would suggest that the administration is not going to open that whole box, as you put it, anytime soon.
Oh, you know, I'm glad you brought up the relationship with the Saudis. That is a relationship that Washington views as very strategic. Saudi Arabia is an important player in the region, and a player that has not at all been happy with the ongoing negotiations, the engagement that Washington is currently having with its arch-rival in the region, Tehran. So the president has a lot of soothing to do there, especially that the Saudis broke openly with Washington in the past year on several issues, one of which was Syria. They were very disappointed how President Obama backed away from conducting airstrikes on Syria at a time when French President Hollande seemed ready to go, and the Saudis very much appreciated that. President Obama threw that ball in the laps of Congress and then backed away from it. But also on Egypt, where, again, a very important and pivotal country in the region, and where Saudi Arabia has been more firmly backing the president, the military there, who might become president, General Sisi, and the Americans have a very different point of view. So there's a number of issues as it relates to the U.S.-Saudi relationship, not only Syria, that President Obama will have to soothe out in his visit next March.
It's an interesting point you make about the links between the Saudi and the military-backed government in Egypt. Do you think that that relationship between the Saudis and the Egyptians today is one reason why President Obama didn't repeat the rhetoric that he had first given in his landmark speech in Cairo in 2009? We will remember that was a big moment of outreach towards the Arab world, paying tribute to the Arab Spring. And then suddenly in the State of the Union address, Egypt is not even mentioned at all.
Absolutely, and I'm smiling here because you know, a bunch of us policy wonks in this town were taking to Twitter as the president was giving his State of the Union address, and it was a very lively debate on social media about the lack of mention of Egypt in the State of the Union, such a pivotal country in the Middle East, and again, where the president gave his landmark address to the Muslim world. And you know, there are different points of view. One point of view, which I understand, is that, well, you know, the White House had nothing good to say about Egypt. The Egyptians are going to be pissed off at the United States whether they chose to one party or the other. And the same, you know, the same applies to U.S. allies in the region, where the Saudis and the Israelis and others seems to be more favorable towards one party or the other. So it seemed that the White House judged that this is an issue that they cannot win, so they decided to keep quiet about it. And it's very telling about the status of the U.S. standing in the region and how it's choosing to disengage from pivotal issues.
And moving away from backing the Arab Spring, in a sense, at least verbally. We'll have to end it there because we've now run out of time. But thank you so much, Firas Maksad, Managing Director of Global Policy Advisors, joining me from Washington, D.C. Do stay tuned to France 24.